Well, it's time. It's time for the grand show that we've all been waiting for. Anybody who helped with the field work on the Atlas knows Ashely, remembers her well. Dr. Ashely Peele was our rock star, encouraging, enthusiastic, and got us out there in the field and kept us all moving and engaged. It was a blast working with her. She's now the Appalachian Mountains. Now, this is a mouthful of a title, young lady, I have to say. The Appalachian Mountains Joint Venture Community Science and Engagement Coordinator for the American Bird Conservancy, the ABC, where her work focuses on applying community science methods to a range of avian conservation questions. And you can tell she wrote this data gaps in the Appalachian region. She's an avian ecologist, having spent 18 years studying avian ecology and conservation in the US and Caribbean. She completed a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology at Tulane and the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center, where she studied population dynamics of migratory songbirds during non-breeding season. After grad school, she became a research scientist at Virginia Tech's Conservation Management Institute, which is the position she was in when we all got to know her as coordinator of the second Virginia Breeding Bird Atlas's data collection, fieldwork, and analysis from 2015 to 2023. Let's give Ashely a big welcome. We're really excited to hear her tell us where things are pointing with the Atlas that so the floor is yours, Ashely.
Thank you for that intro, Diane. While I am trying to correctly share my screen, let me tell you all that this was one of the hardest talks to put together, or that I've had to put together in quite a long time, for two reasons. One, well, actually, first, let me make sure. Diane, are you seeing the right screen? Is it the full screen and not my notes page? Okay, great.
Yes.
I'm seeing a bird playing a banjo.
There we go. Yep, y'all see Earl, so we're in the right place. Great. Yeah, he's my new mascot. I'll tell you all more about him later. Um, but yeah, this was a really challenging talk to put together in large part because one, there's so much we could talk about. I don't think it will surprise anyone to know that there's just sort of a massive volume of results and really neat things coming out of this project. But the second reason was I anticipated that this was going to be like a family reunion, and it is. Watching all of these faces pop up on the screen as everyone was joining the Zoom was just really fun to see so many friends. And because of the COVID time warp and just all the craziness of the last few years, I've seen few of you in person and I've missed you greatly. So it's really fun to see so many faces. But all that to say, I started out with well over 100 slides and I really did my best to pare it down so I wouldn't keep you here all night. So with that, I'm going to dive in. I want everyone to think of this as a teaser because ultimately that's what I'm trying to accomplish, is to give you a sneak peek essentially into what will be illustrated in much more depth in the BBA publication when it comes out. So I'm not going to talk about myself a lot. Diane gave me a great intro. Most of y'all know me or know my roots. I grew up in Florida as a swamp kid, but my family roots are in Eastern Tennessee and Southwest Virginia, and I spent summers up in Eastern Tennessee. So I was really happy to get back to the Central Apps, which have always felt like home to me. I was lucky enough to discover my passion for birds and bird conservation as a freshman in college, and research, grad school, PhD, yada yada. We'll gloss over that. And right after grad school, I moved to Southwest Virginia to coordinate the Virginia Breeding Bird Atlas project. And it is really surreal for me to think that I met many of you for the first time in Roanoke back in 2016 at one of our awesome in-person VSO annual meetings, which I really miss a lot. So it's wild how much has changed and how much we've gotten done over the last 8 years. Yeah, my kiddo, who's 3.5 now, says hi. Many of you have seen her on Zooms in the past couple of years. Yeah, and now she said now I'm the community science and engagement coordinator for the JV, and I just tiny plug to say stay tuned for upcoming citizen science projects in Western Virginia and West Virginia that I'm hoping to get off the ground in the next couple years here. You can bet I will be bugging you. But I thought I'd just take a few minutes, and for the folks who were not heavily involved with this project, and maybe you're new to Virginia or just new to this community, I wanted to take a few minutes and remind everyone what this project was all about. What was the Second Virginia Breeding Bird Atlas Project? So to put it very simply, it was a citizen science-based effort to document breeding bird status, distribution, and abundance across the Commonwealth. So I'm going to kind of break that down a little bit. So the citizen science piece is, in my mind, one of the most important pieces. This means that the majority of the effort, the work, was done by volunteers. And I first wanted to just highlight the dedicated regional coordinators. Some of these folks joined on from the beginning and busted their butts for the whole 5 years. Some folks kind of evolved into this role as we had regional needs develop, and they just kind of raised up as leaders in helping me get this thing done. So I just wanted to show all these faces and thank a handful of them are on this tonight, and thank them again for all of their hard work and dedication and helping me get this thing across the finish line. And then, far more volunteers than I could ever show pictures of. When all was said and done, we had almost 1,500 folks who had contributed data to this project, and they were obviously lots of birders, lots of students, wildlife rehabbers, university faculty. We had an Irish gentleman who's super involved with Irish atlasing, contributed to the Virginia Breeding Bird Atlas. I think he was the farthest traveled, if I'm remembering correctly. So it was truly an army of folks that got this job done. And another important piece is that we worked really hard to engage a diverse partner community in this. I ended up working with close to 60 NGOs. If they were interested in conservation or birds in Virginia, I was bugging them. So really built a tremendous community that I think that's one of the things I'm most proud of with this project, is just the community of folks we pulled in to help accomplish what we needed to do the BBA. So I thought, just to orient everyone, it would be useful to see a timeline, just to kind of show where we've been, where we've come from, and where we're at now with this project. So we launched in 2016 and spent the next 5 years in a frenzy of data collection, which we wrapped in the fall of 2020. And just to talk a little bit about what went into and came out of the field data collection, the majority of it, as I said, was done by volunteers, and my rough calculation is that our volunteers contributed over 80,000 hours of field time to this project, which is pretty staggering when you really think about how much of some folks' lives that is. That's a huge number. And what that resulted in was, over 10 million birds reported to the project, over 800,000 breeding behaviors documented, 108,000 eBird checklists. And just for context, I should have put it up here, but the first BBA that was conducted from 1984 to 1989 had about, I think it was around 90,000 breeding behaviors logged or observed. So just to give you the scope, from 90,000 to 800,000 specific breeding behaviors documented. So the jump in scope is pretty tremendous, and a lot of that has to do with just how much technology really facilitates data collection these days. Another thing I wanted to underscore before I move on is just that one of the really important things about BBAs generally is that many previously unbirded regions of the state got surveyed as a part of this effort. eBird is awesome, but we birders tend to stick to our favorite haunts, and if left to our own devices, we'll never go to big chunks of the state because, we don't necessarily have reason to if we can get all the birds we want to see in certain places. And it ends up leading to some huge data gaps, which from a population modeling standpoint, understanding how our birds are distributed across the landscape and how they're doing, that's a problem. So one of the things I'm really proud of, and we'll talk a little bit more about how it happened, but it's just how much gap filling we did as part of this project and how much that improved our understanding of Virginia's bird populations. So data collection, from there we went into data review. This began immediately after I had a baby and COVID. in the midst of COVID still. So it was a wild couple years of intensive data review. I'm not going to talk about this in depth, although if any of you guys are data nerds and ever want to have a more in-depth conversation about this, I'd be happy to. But the data review process, it actually began during the Atlas. It wasn't all after. We started doing some of it during the project just to try to get out in front of it. But the core areas that we were reviewing the data for or focusing on were breeding codes, the breeding behaviors folks were submitting, the dates, spatial review, which basically is just where were those observations logged. And then we also, a major part of the data review process was gathering and incorporating ancillary data sets. So these are data sets that were not in eBird, but partner organizations, universities, et cetera, different research projects were collecting and added a lot of value to our existing data set. So that was a huge part of the data review process as well, was aggregating all those other data sources and making them mush into our final breeders database. I should add that, we had a lot of automation. We did our best to automate a lot of this, but at the end of the day, anytime a record got flagged, nothing got upgraded or downgraded without a human looking at it and assessing it and looking at like the notes the observer had submitted and all that good stuff. So this is a total back of the envelope estimate, but it was somewhere between 100 and 200,000 records that we reviewed by hand. So a human read and reviewed and looked at that record. It might have been more. I didn't keep careful track because it was so many layers of review. But for that reason, thanks to all of you who followed the VA-BBA2 guidelines, we tried to keep the review as blind as possible, so we were not biased in any way. But I know some folks stuck to it, and you saved us some time, so thank you for that. So after we completed that intensive data review process, data analysis began in 2022. And again, I'm not going to go into this in a ton of depth, but I just want to give you a high-level overview of what the core data products are, for lack of a better phrase for it. The different materials that I'm going to be showing you tonight as far as results go. And I should preface this by saying so much more could be done with this, even though it took a lot of, this is a lot of effort, and I had a team working with me on this, and we've put a tremendous amount of time in producing these materials. There's so much more we could do. So I'm going to be advocating for folks recruiting and looping in potential grad students to do projects from this massive resource that you all helped us build. But to just explain this, so there's 4 core areas of results I'm going to be talking about tonight. Well, actually 5. I'll show you the 5th in a sec. That came from all this data that you guys collected. The first is the one you're probably most familiar with, breeding evidence maps. That's going to be sort of the traditional product people think of when they think of BBAs, and we'll look at that in just a second. The second one in green are the occupancy models. This is getting at the distribution of different species across the landscape. And fortunately, we were able to produce occupancy change models and maps for a subset of our species. Kudos to those of you who were involved in the first Virginia Breeding Bird Atlas project. That data set was thorough enough that we were able to do this, not for all species, but most states, or I don't know if I should say most, but many states have been unable to actually model change over time just because of limitations of those historic data sets. But we had to do a little fancy footwork with the modeling to make it work, but we were able to get at occupancy change, which has really been extremely informative from understanding how our bird populations have shifted on the landscape and also informing some of our regulatory and management decisions. So, and then that 4th bucket there in purple is a phenology analysis. This is looking at how breeding timelines have shifted, and a number of you have reached out and asked me questions about those. So I know, yeah, that'll be a fun one to get into. It's pretty wild. I'll just preface it with that. It's wild how much it's changed. I don't know that that will surprise anyone, but dates have been shifting dramatically for a while. We'll talk about that. And then the 5th bucket, let's see, do I have it in here? Yeah. 5th bucket is derived not from this final breeders database rooted in the volunteer data set, but by a fairly big data set that was generated by field technicians who were on the landscape at the same time that our volunteers were out there. But these folks were conducting point counts, a very different sort of survey, very different methodology. And our field techs conducted almost 16,000 of those counts across the state from 2017 to 2020. So that was another massive effort that was also a part of this project. But we use these data to model abundance and get at density maps for a subset of our species. So we'll look at some of that too. So I thought what I'd do first is just give you guys a sense of what these look like, and then we'll get into some more specifics. So breeding evidence maps, as I was saying, this is sort of a traditional thing that folks are used to seeing from breeding bird atlas projects. This is telling you essentially the strength of breeding evidence we have for a given species. So we're going to change the legend so it's possible, probable, and confirmed to be consistent with the breeding code buckets. But the yellow, orange, and red allude to breeding categories. So yellow is a possible breeder, red is a confirmed breeder. And I just thought for everyone's interest, I'd throw up common nighthawk from the first BBA and common nighthawk now. This one's kind of a downer. Unfortunately, a lot of these might be a little bit of a bummer when we look at species trends, but I don't think anybody's going to be shocked that a lot of our bird populations have declined. But it's important that we understand how and where they still are and all that good stuff. So next one, occupancy results. I'll talk about these in a little bit more depth here in a bit, but this is just an illustration of what an occupancy model produces. And this is really just telling us, is a given species present in a block over the course of the Atlas project? So the red blocks show there's 100% probability or predicted probability that a Baltimore Oriole is going to be in these locations, all the way down to yellow, meaning there's very little likelihood that an Oriole is going to be in that given block. Then for the occupancy change models, this is for the same species. So these are showing us how the probability, the likelihood that a given bird is in a given block, how that changed from the first atlas to the second atlas. So in this, when we're looking at these, the blues indicate declines, the reds and the oranges indicate increases, and then that creamy color is just stable, unchanged. Based on our best model predictions. So here's another example. You can see Baltimore Orioles have declined quite a bit throughout the Piedmont and in areas where we've had a lot of development throughout the state, Southeastern Virginia corridor and the Nova corridor. We'll talk about, I'm kind of whizzing through these because a little later in the talk, I'm going to dig into some more species highlights and talk about some of these results in a little bit more depth. And then population density. So this is from those abundance models derived from the technician-generated data sets. So one of the cool things we can do with abundance models is, it's one thing to look at this, the occupancy map, and say, okay, that's cool. It shows us there's at least one Baltimore Oriole in a given block across the landscape. But if we jump to the abundance maps, this is actually getting at density. So this is giving us a much more detailed picture of how these birds are distributed on the landscape. And as you can see, this really starts giving us a different view of what's going on and how these birds, how much more abundant they are, say through the valley, the mountain valley regions and the southwestern part of the state, as opposed to the Piedmont and the coastal plain. And then the phenology, the phenological shifts, talking about breeding timelines. I'm going to talk about this in some depth because it was communicated to me that this was an area of interest, and it is pretty fascinating. So this is just one quick example to say one of the things that came out of this analysis is learning that the median date for folks to observe nest building in Baltimore Orioles has shifted to 13 days earlier in the second breeding bird atlas than it was in the first one. That is not the craziest example we'll talk about. So we'll get into that in a little bit more depth too. All right, so that brings us to publication process. We've been working on that for a while, but it sort of officially kicked off last fall. And this year we hired a managing editor last year, and we have species account authors toiling away writing species accounts. I'm not going to talk a ton about the publication tonight, but if folks have questions, we can certainly get into that later on. All right, but let's get into the meaty stuff. What are we learning so far from this big old data set. So I'm going to start with talking about range shifts. So what's been changing? How have our bird populations been changing on the landscape? Who's here now that wasn't back in the 80s? Who have we lost? Then we'll get into the phenology, the timeline shifts in a little bit more depth, do some ecoregion spotlights, kind of go through some results for a handful of species in a little bit more depth, just so you guys can have a clearer sense of, like, say, what the species accounts, what types of information will be presented there. And then very briefly, we'll talk about conservation impacts at the end. If we have time, I may blast through that a little bit, but we'll see how we're doing. I promised Diane I would try hard to stick to 45 minutes. We'll see if I can do it. All right, so what's changed since the 1980s? I'm not going to belabor this one. I don't think folks are going to be terribly surprised by this list of species that we have effectively lost as breeders in Virginia since the first breeding bird atlas. All of these species have been on the decline. You know, species like Buick's wren have been extirpated from the whole eastern U.S. And yeah, I don't think any of this is terribly surprising. It's a bummer, but you know, birds are shifting. There's a lot of northward push going on, particularly with species like northern water thrush, that just aren't breeding as far south as they once did. And similarly, when we talk about species that are here now that weren't in the first breeding bird atlas, some really interesting ones that, of course, always catch our eye was that painted bunting we had breeding out in the eastern shore one year. The influx of anhinga that we now have breeding in the state, that certainly wasn't a thing back in the 80s. Similar story with Mississippi kites, black-necked stilts. And what's interesting to note is of this list, you know, the majority of these new breeders, in air quotes, and let me pause and say, I know some of these species have been in Virginia for a while, so I know they didn't just show up at the atlas. I know some of the birders who have been around are quick to yell at me about that. I know that's not what we're saying, but they were not confirmed in the first atlas, and they were now confirmed in this one. But sorry, back to the point I was making. The majority of these new breeders are southern species pushing north, right? This is what we're seeing. Climate change is happening, and we're not going to even debate it on this talk tonight. And species are responding, and they're shifting northward. That's a case for that painted bunting, Mississippi kites, anhingas, etc. Yeah, sorry, here's our Mississippi kite example. These are all our breeding records of Mississippi kites. So, but what's interesting, there is one exception to this. There's our anhinga. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. The exception I wanted to get to are common mergs. So these guys are shifting southward, and they've really expanded into Virginia by tracking southward along our major rivers. And that's where we get these guys breeding in the summer, right? They're on most of the major river corridors in the western half of the state now. And this is a new arrival. They weren't breeding in Virginia, especially in any number in the 80s. And they've really kind of moved in the last decade or so. And their numbers just continue to climb every year. So it's an interesting one to see kind of a reverse of what's the overall trend of, you know, southern breeders moving northward. These guys are bucking that trend a little bit. Okay. Now I'm going to get into this shifting phenology section and talk about how breeding season timelines have been changing. And I'm going to preface this or set this all up by saying this was not a planned product from the BBA, but I kind of went down a rabbit hole with this one. You know, we struggled and knew throughout the atlas that, you know, having really strict timelines, like time bounds on breeding records and whatnot, was going to be challenging because timelines have become so squishy. And even, you know, trying to set the breeding timelines at the start of this project was a challenging thing. One, because there's just not great information available on a regional basis. It's even since, you know, 2016 that has improved as eBird data products have improved and become more detailed, but it was hard and it was a squishy situation in terms of setting dates. So we were much looser. I'll just say that. I don't want to say looser. We were had a little bit more flexibility with the dates, especially as part of the date review process. But anyway, I kind of asked this question of, can the BBA data help us assess this question of changing breeding phenologies across a diverse range of species? And I was kind of shocked that no one had really done this before. There's not many BBAs that really look at phenology, but what's surprising about that is BBAs are one of the best sources of information on breeding phenology, because at any given time, most people, nobody's really tracking this sort of data or this sort of information. So sorry, this is a long-winded way to set up. To set up and say this was a rabbit hole I went down, but it's pretty fascinating. So I'm not going to get into super detailed on the process, although again, happy to talk more about it if folks are interested. I confine this to confirmed breeding behaviors because for a lot of reasons, it was the cleanest and way to handle all this. And I ended up kind of binning those behaviors into nesting behaviors and post-hatching behaviors. So nesting behaviors are anything up to the point when the chicks are out of the egg, right? They've got actual nestlings. And I did this originally, I actually did this on just a code by code basis. So I did this analysis for each individual code, but then I noticed a really interesting trend, which was that nesting behaviors, so our median date for nesting behaviors, with some exceptions, have shifted towards earlier, much earlier in some cases. Our red-bellied woodpeckers are the median date for folks to observe them on nests actively going into nest cavities is 28 days earlier, 16 days earlier for blue-gray gnatcatcher nest building, similar story for Baltimore oriole. So on the nesting side, what we are seeing happening makes some sense, right? Birds seem to be arriving earlier and or starting to engage in breeding activities right away. I think there's two things happening. Birds are coming earlier, and then they're taking less time to get rolling with the actual nesting breeding process. But then on the flip side, over here for post-hatching behaviors, what was surprising is that for many species, the median date for observing that has actually gotten later. So observers are seeing fledglings on the landscape quite a bit later, seeing feeding young behavior quite a bit later. Same, that scenario. And just to show you some other extreme examples of this, what I'm talking about, cedar waxwings, nest building 34 days earlier, 35 days earlier on nest for red-tailed hawks. But then similarly, wood thrush feeding young 26 days later, mockingbirds feeding nestlings, have nestlings in the nest and hatchlings in the nest and are feeding young much later. So while these exact number of days, there's some squish in here, right? Because we're limited in terms of the amount of data we have to pull from. But this is certainly an interesting trend, right? It's an interesting behavior. And there's a lot of theories on why we're seeing earlier on one end and then later on the other. Are we seeing things happening like birds are getting here early and they're starting to attempt to breed early, but then because of erratic weather conditions or whatnot in late spring, early summer, there's a higher rate of nest failure. There's a lot of different possibilities, and frankly, we're just not sure yet. But it's opening up a lot of area for further research and questions into trying to get a handle on why we're seeing these patterns. The other thing that's interesting is we're also seeing species where the same species, just the window is just widening dramatically. So the birds are getting here earlier, they're starting to breed earlier, but there are also, there seem to be more instances of multiple broods. And they've also just got fledglings on the landscape a lot later. So both sides of that breeding window in some species cases, like the ones I've illustrated here, are happening. And it's not just resident species, right? We could understand the breeding season getting bigger for resident species that don't have to go anywhere, right? They're just going to hang out and take advantage. If the resources are there, if the seasonality is suitable, they're going to keep breeding. But we're even seeing this trend in a number of migratory species as well. So it's, as I said, tantalizing and really interesting. There's a lot of possible interpretations of these patterns. Some migratory species, as I was saying, may be lengthening their overall time they're spending on the breeding grounds. Birds are arriving and nesting earlier. But again, nest failure may be an issue, disconnect between food resources and the timing that these birds are attempting to breed. A lot of this is almost certainly driven by warming temperatures and whatnot. So yeah, there's a lot to chew on there. And as I said, this was a bit of a pet side project, but we're going to keep working on it and are hoping to get this published. And there are, I will say to my delight, there are a number of other modern atlases who are now starting to dig into this themselves and look at ways they can generate similar phenological analyses from their data sets. So it's an interesting time for trying to understand how birds are responding to in some cases, pretty dramatic changes in our seasonal phenology schedules. Okay, and with that, let's see, how am I doing on time? All right, I think I'm doing okay. So I'm going to jump over into some ecoregion spotlights and kind of zoom in on some particular species from different parts of the state that are just interesting examples. And like I said, give you a bit of a snapshot into what the species accounts will, what types of materials will be in the species accounts rather. And I know I'm just touching on a lot of meaty topics, so there I will definitely hang out and make time at the end for questions if folks have them. But first, let's jump in with a coastal plain species, a coastal breeder. I thought we'd look at the least tern. These guys are interesting because, you know, they have, like many species, been declining. This is where we had breeding evidence for least terns in this atlas. The red, again, the red blocks indicate confirmed breeders. So it's where we would expect. You know, it's basically in the traditional nesting areas, nesting zone for the species. I wanted to show, so this is an example of the occupancy map for this bird. And once in a while, we have these weird outliers pop up, which usually are a function of weird habitat or climate related data, because we're using habitat and climatic variables to predict where birds are going to be on the landscape the most. But again, nothing too, other than that little outlier, nothing too surprising here. When we look at the change map, things are a little uglier. We have seen some pretty big declines, as we said, across the whole range for this species. And unfortunately, I think there was a lot of hope that we were going to see them shifting and nesting inland on rooftops, say on gravel rooftops. Early on in the atlas, there was hope that there was going to be more records reported from that type of nesting occurrence, but we actually ended up getting very, very few of those types of records. So some of that may be a function of those types of roofs just aren't really out there anymore. People don't roof in that same way with those old kind of gravelly tops, and so they're losing that option as well. I'm going to jump to a Piedmont breeder, which, well, they're sort of Piedmont and statewide, really. We can't really call them a Piedmont breeder, but we actually don't have that many species that are like a Piedmont breeder. So whippoorwills are another interesting one to look at. I'm curious how many people would have been able to identify that as a whippoorwill if if I flashed that picture up. They are goofy looking little boogers. This was a picture from one of our very few breeding confirmations that were logged in the state. One of our field techs observed this on one of the military bases. In fact, that little guy was found. She found him right. Oh, I should show it. I can't remember. Right. I think it was Quantico. I think that's Quantico there. Somebody's going to yell at me if I'm wrong on which base that is. But so this is breeding evidence for whippoorwills. Doesn't look too concerning when we look at distribution. Not surprised to see that the Piedmont, we still have pretty high occupancy for whips in the Piedmont. And then over here in the Cumberland region of Virginia, the far southwestern corner of Virginia, where we've got some pretty good populations of whips still, and then up along the West Virginia border. If we jump to let's see. Oh, I forgot I was going to say this. So when we're talking about the occupancy maps and digging into what they can tell us, or the occupancy models rather, the way these models work is we are essentially trying to predict based on things like habitat types, land cover characteristics, climatic conditions, etc. We're using those to best predict where on the landscape these birds are likely to be. And obviously that is all predicated on the data that you guys collected as well. So these models all churn out, give us really interesting information about habitat associations and what are the things that are best predicting the probability of, in this example, a whippoorwill being in a given block on the landscape. And so just to illustrate, what that means, what that can look like, whips are negatively correlated with the amount of development in a block, not terribly surprising. They're highly positively correlated with the amount of early successional habitat in a block, that's young regenerating forest structure. And then they're also positively correlated with forest in a block. So these models are useful not only in giving us these distribution maps, which are fun to look at, and it's interesting and helpful to see where on the landscape these birds are most likely to occur, but they're also telling us which characteristics of, again, the landscape, climate, etc., are most important in predicting where these birds are going to occur. So if we jump to the change models for these guys, as the occupancy map sort of illustrated, fairly stable populations in the Piedmont, as indicated by the cream color, but we've had a lot of decline in other parts of the state. So along the coastal plain, Northern Virginia, and then through the Mountain Valley region as well. And let's see. Okay. Now I'm going to jump and talk about grassland species, eastern meadowlarks. I could spend a whole talk talking about or speaking about what's going on with grassland birds. Maybe that'll be a talk for a future time. There's some really interesting stuff going on with grassland species, but we'll use eastern meadowlark as an illustration of that this time. So meadowlark are interesting, right? Because they are still fairly widespread and abundant on the landscape. When we look at things like the breeding evidence maps, like, whoa, we've got meadowlarks everywhere. They're doing fine. And if we look at our occupancy models, similar story, although some more things pop out. I think when we first look at our occupancy maps, we see that developed areas in the eastern part of the state are pretty sparse when it comes to meadowlark populations. But again, it's not too surprising. If we're looking at what are the most important predictors of where these guys are in the landscape, it's primarily agriculture and early successional habitat. Interestingly, they are negatively correlated with habitat heterogeneity, meaning that they are less likely to be in a block that has a bunch of different habitat types present, which really translates to they're less likely to be somewhere that's highly fragmented, which isn't too surprising again. But if we keep moving through the different materials we have for this species, if we jump to change, we see that we've had some declines. Although again, if we're just looking at occupancy, a lot of this data is that cream color, which suggests the populations are stable. Not surprising, they've declined in Nova, Richmond area, etc. They look fairly stable, but this is where being able to look at species density and having those abundance models gets useful, because we jump over to those, it starts again giving us much more detail on where these birds are and how they vary across the landscape. So while we still have them spread throughout the Piedmont, we also have super high densities of them through the Mountain Valley corridor. And one of the things that's been coming out increasingly, not just for Virginia, but their whole Central Apps, is that the sort of grassland agricultural landscapes present in the Appalachian parts of the Central Apps and the Mid-Atlantic region are increasingly important for grassland nesting species. So this trend isn't unique to eastern meadowlark. We're seeing similar things happening with bobolink and dickcissel, and ultimately what that's leading us to is that grassland habitats in the mid-Atlantic region, particularly in the mountain valleys and the Apps, are lighting up as more and more important refugia for grassland species that are declining so dramatically in other parts of their range. All right, I'm going to jump to Mountain Valley species. And for this one, I wanted to zoom out for a sec and just, again, kind of put into context what's going on with birds globally, because there's actually some cool news for what's going on in Virginia for a number of species, some encouraging news. So we've all seen these very doom and gloom figures from the 3 billion birds reports. The majority of different types of birds from different biomes are declining, with the exception of wetlands, grasslands, and eastern forest birds, which are what I'm going to focus on for the Mountain Valley examples, have declined a lot. Species like wood thrush, cerulean warblers, they've become kind of the poster children for eastern forest songbird declines. But there are reasons for hope. Many globally declining species actually appear to be stable or even increasing in areas of the Central Appalachians, including parts of Western Virginia. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some examples of that. Just to illustrate kind of, again, the global context for what's going on with these species, I pulled the eBird trends for both cerulean and wood thrush. And while the overall picture for ceruleans is a little bleak with some pretty major declines throughout the core of their Central Appalachian range, we are finding that there are strongholds, right? The areas showing up in blue, both over here in little pockets in Virginia and then in West Virginia and southeastern Ohio, these are areas where they are stable or increasing. And so if we look at kind of this broader regional trend and compare that with what we're seeing in Virginia, it's sort of telling us a similar story. When we look at the occupancy change map, look at how their distribution has changed in Virginia since the 1980s. Yes, we are seeing declines. We have some declines, but we're also seeing a lot of areas with stable populations and even potentially some slightly increasing populations along the Blue Ridge Parkway, up through Shenandoah, and even in some pockets of far southwestern Virginia. And so this is encouraging, right? We've been hopeful that the Central Apps, given the scale and amount of habitat available for a lot of these forest songbirds, would prove to be a refuge. And for some species, this seems to be the case so far. That's the abundance map. I'm not going to spend too much time on that. So jumping to wood thrush, these guys have been declining dramatically in the northeastern part of their range. But again, they've actually been more so than the cerulean even, they've been increasing, significantly increasing in the Central Appalachians. And so increasing attention is being turned to our region for wood thrush conservation. One, to kind of figure out why are they doing so well in the Central Apps, and what can we do to maintain that trend? And even if we look at Virginia, it's interesting to note that in Eastern Virginia, we're seeing some pretty strong declining trends for wood thrush populations, but then in the western third of the state, they're increasing or stable. So if we look at our BBA products from the wood thrush, similar story, you know, they look very abundant across the state if we were just looking at occupancy. If we were just saying, are they likely to be in a block? Like, well, they're still everywhere. And if we look at the change map, again, doesn't look too bad. Some declines in the east around developed areas, but that's not too surprising. And then if we look at our abundance map, again, we see that decent distributions, decent densities throughout the Piedmont, but we get really much higher densities in the western third of the state. So again, these montane regions are proving to be really important from a habitat conservation standpoint for this species. So just takeaway point here is that as we lose habitats elsewhere, the Central Appalachian states are likely to become this increasingly important refuge for migratory bird species. So as you are, you know, advocating for, if any of you engage in advocacy related to habitat conservation and management for conservation purposes, pay attention to what's going on in the Appalachian region, because it's, wow, obviously the whole state of Virginia is extremely important for our migratory bird populations. There's some rapidly declining species that are becoming more and more dependent on our montane or mountain valley regions. So just an important takeaway, I think. And with that, so my last section, very briefly, because we're at 8:30 and I know it's getting late, I just lightly wanted to touch on some of the ways that the Atlas data have already, even in this early stage, been applied for conservation impact and management. I stole this from my colleague Sergio Harding at VDWR because he had made this list of all the areas that the Atlas products were already informing what VDWR is doing. So in all of these spaces, they are already using both what they learned from doing the Atlas project, what we've learned from doing the Atlas project, but also they are taking these data results and applying it to some core areas of what they do. So the big picture ones I wanted to just very briefly touch on are that And the regulatory review and conservation planning side of things, the state of Virginia, well, and all states are in the middle of revising their state wildlife action plans. And those plans are super important because they essentially set the status and conservation need for every species of wildlife in the state. And one of the things that's been really exciting for me, through the lens of the Breeding Bird Atlas coordinator, is I am on the State Wildlife Action Plan Committee, revision committee for birds. And as you might imagine, outside of the atlas, there is actually pretty limited updated information on most of our bird species. We can pull things from BBS, we can pull things from BBA, from eBird, but those sources, every source of data has its limitations. And what's been really exciting is we already have been able to pull in BBA results and data to better inform this regulatory review process, because we had information from the BBA that they didn't have available from any other sources. So it's already proving to be really important from a management and regulatory review standpoint for our breeding bird species. So one very tangible and very immediate way that the BBA is being used and being applied. And then a little bit more broadly, on the habitat management and research and monitoring side of things, the agency has, well, and I should have highlighted land acquisition as well, but BDWR has a lot of lands, but is always looking at further land acquisition and looking at how to best manage the existing properties that they have. And one of the things that's been really valuable already about the BBA is highlighting some species of importance that are present on the WMAs and getting into some conservation planning, how do I put it? They are better able to plan around species of conservation concern because the BBA has shed more light on which properties are lighting up as important. Let's see, what else do I want to say about this? I was going to go through and talk a little bit more about some research and monitoring things, but I think I'm going to wrap up there and just say that a number of research projects, like a couple, have already grown from the BBA project. I've been involved with a really in-depth study of Swainson's warblers across the whole Central Appalachian region and really across their whole range, which was done by one of my former students who got his start on the BBA project, and the Virginia Swainson's warblers were an important part of that. So there's a lot going on, but there's so much more we could do, as I was alluding to before. So I'm hoping we can get some more momentum going to get folks to use this resource and build new projects from it. With that, I wanted to transition. The last few slides I have, I just wanted to do some quick thanks and remembrances, because I really haven't had the chance to do this in a long time and do it in a thorough way since we wrapped up field data collection. And I already have thought of specific slides I should have done and specific groups of people I should have highlighted. So this is in no way exhaustive, but there were a few folks I wanted to highlight. So the first one, this is in remembrance of one of our regional coordinators, Louis Barnett, passed away a couple years ago, and he was an incredible friend and birder and awesome BBA coordinator and just really an all-around incredible human being. And I wanted to recognize him and his contributions to this and just say he is missed, and that we remember. And then I'm going to jump into some thanks. So there are some unsung heroes of this project, because their contributions were a little less traditional. And so I really wanted to call them out in this. Bob Scammerhorn, when I first got to Virginia, reached out and gave me what truly was a treasure trove of photos to use in Atlas materials. And then he ended up, for the entire project, contributing pro bono his graphic design expertise, helping me make promotional materials. I mean, if we made something that had cool graphics, it was because of Bob. And he did that all for free, which is a tremendous thing because that's what he does for a living. And he really contributed so much of his valuable time to this project. And I can't understate how helpful it was to have this amazing trove of photos to go to and pull from materials. It saved me so much time. And so I just wanted to highlight Bob and that contribution because it's an easy one to get buried in all of this, but it was incredibly valuable. Another one of these is Rob Belowski. He really helped me establish the social media presence for the VBA and then keep it going. It is not an exaggeration to say Rob saved my butt because I'm terrible at social media, and he is far more savvy and good at it. And he spent years helping me keep that going. And as you all know, that can sometimes be a thankless and arduous task in its own right. So I just wanted to thank Rob again for that help and contribution. There are so many more people I could call out for specific things, but a group I wanted to call out were my blockbusters. These are the folks who traveled all over Southern and Western Virginia on their own dime to help me fill data gaps. They really helped push us across the finish line in those final couple of years when I was freaking out over how we were going to get parts of Southwest Virginia covered or parts of the Southern Piedmont that were just black holes for data. And so many folks stepped up again on their own dime to fill those gaps. And so I just wanted to recognize them. And finally, I'll just end with final thanks to the hundreds of volunteers. Many of you I'm lucky enough to call friends, and just want to thank you guys for making this all possible, and frankly, for helping me to fall in love with citizen science and really give my career a whole new trajectory. This was a very formative experience for me as an early career professional. And, you know, there were a lot of days when you made me feel like this. I was like big mama bird looking down at her babies going crazy, going, oh, I'm going to kill them. No, but in all seriousness, in most days, made me feel like this. Most days I was just felt so privileged to get to work with this community and to be welcomed as warmly as I was by these folks. You guys were very kind to a newbie fresh out of grad school who was just trying to find her way. So I just wanted to thank you all for that. And I'm going to stop rambling now. And thank you for listening. And as I said, I'm super happy to answer questions. I'll stop sharing my screen now, but I can always pull things back up as we go through questions.
Fabulous presentation, Ashely. Thanks so much. It's just amazing stuff. We love that you've moved on in your career to stepping up, but we're so thankful that you stayed in Virginia. So thanks for that too. So let's go to who's monitoring the chat for questions.
I am.
If you guys have time, anybody that needs to leave, I'll say right now, thanks so much for being here, but we're going to hang on for as long as Ashely's got the fortitude to do it.
I have the chat up here I'm looking at. So can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
So we had a few questions in the chat, and I'm sure there will be more. One person asked about the block maps, whether they're still available on the internet.
Oh, is this Donna's question? Yeah, I was just seeing that. Yeah, Donna, I think that's an artifact of, so that was all hosted by VDWR and their GIS folks, and I think that they have taken a lot of that down, or most of that down at this point, because of some restructuring in the agency. So the short answer is, if there was stuff you still wanted, I'll send it. Just ping me and I'll send it to you, because I still have all that. But as far as online access to some of those maps, that might be a taller order these days. But there will be, let's see, you're asking. Maybe Donna can follow up if she had a question about what exactly, I wasn't quite sure what you were asking about what would be published on the website. So I'm not sure if that fully answered her question, but.
Yeah, I guess it's possible it'll be in the Atlas website, but that's a good question. The committee can look at that.
I will say a lot of material is going to be published on the Atlas website. Oh, and something I didn't touch on, but this is reminding me of, is that the whole breeders database, so the final breeders database I was talking about, we went through all this review to generate, and we pulled in all these other data sources. That will also be published and made public for everyone. So VDWR is going to publish that database just as the Atlas database. And once it is live, anyone will be able to download that and play with it, run analyses, whatnot. So it won't be published, or the database won't be through eBird because there's a lot of reasons for that. But it will be available probably in the next, I'm not actually positive on the timeline. I would have to ask Sergio, but that should be coming pretty imminently. For those of you who are data nerds,
Great.
it's coming.
Okay. I had a comment just about the metal density map that you showed. The Audubon Society of Northern Virginia does a lot of work up here with trying to work with landowners and parks and so forth. One of the few big grassland areas in Fairfax County is the landfill. And we hit it last year on our birdathon. We had bobolinks, meadowlarks, grasshopper sparrows, blue grosbeak, et cetera, et cetera. So just looking at the density map where Fairfax County was kind of missing for this species, just says to me that what they're doing with the landfill folks these days is pretty important, which is they're trying to work with them on their mowing schedule. Mm-hmm. So they're, not mowing while they're active nests and so forth in the grassy, there's large grassy areas in the landfill. I guess this leads to another question I didn't put in my comment here, is whether or not the atlas can help them figure out what the mowing dates should be. Is there enough information on breeding activity that they could figure out,
Yeah. And for meadowlark, I think that would probably be feasible because since they are a widespread species, we actually have decent sample sizes for different breeding codes, breeding behaviors. I can't say that we would be able to do like a Northern Virginia specific timeline, but we could probably just look at, the eastern half of the state and come up with average times and whatnot.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a good illustration of another way that these data can be used in a very applied way. That definitely could be extracted.
Great. I'll pass that on to them. Guy Babineau has a question relative to the Appalachian Valley as a refugia. I guess, as we reduce reliance on coal, are there opportunities to recover areas used for mining? Can we learn anything from the Atlas about these areas that might help us understand how to direct these efforts for recovery?
Oh God.
And Guy, if you want to unmute and elaborate on that, help.
Well, I was one of those blockbusters and going out to Buchanan County and seeing some of those former mining sites. I mean, just like you're talking about with the Dixie, with the landfill. I mean, there are grasshopper sparrows, meadowlarks, all kinds of birds that you wouldn't necessarily expect at the top of a mountain that had been, the top had been taken out, but then, was recovering. So I was just curious, it seems like that's something that's going to be happening more, and if this is areas of refugia, can we do something, and can we learn from the Alice about what to do?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a great question. And you sort of set me up to talk about my current job and things I'm working on in my current job, my current organization, the Appalachian Mountains Migratory Bird Joint Venture. This is a lot of what we're focused on. So we're looking at both conservation needs and concerns, but also opportunities. And opportunities is really kind of the name of the game right now because there's a tremendous amount of funding coming into the Appalachian region through IRA and BIL. These are some major legislative acts that came down from this current administration. And so that very thing you talked about, Guy, is one of the things that's getting a lot more funding. So there's two sides to this. There's that some of these mountaintop sites are just so badly degraded that the effort it would take to reforest them is just sort of gargantuan and probably not worth the resources. And so one of the things we're advocating for is creating a space for their maintaining these grassland, high elevation grassland habitats in areas where reforestation just isn't really going to work. It's either too costly or just everything's too degraded. But that's a good thing too, right? Because the Appalachians aren't supposed to be a single forest monoculture. It's always been a diverse landscape with early successional and grasslands. And so that mining reclamation and setting aside some of those lands for grasslands, so being long-term grassland management instead of trying to push reforestation is definitely something we are looking at and trying to advocate for across the region. And I think it's a great opportunity. Vermivora, we find a lot of vermivora, so the blue-wing warblers, in some cases golden wings, use those high elevation grassland early successional areas too. So yeah, I think in the context of Virginia, and actually West Virginia too. West Virginia did a BBA, and both of them have been enlightening in terms of some of these different early successional and grassland species that can benefit from those types of habitats. So I'm not sure if that fully answers it, but it's definitely on our radar and is a big priority. I could talk a lot about how shifting away from coal is both an opportunity and a threat to different things. Not a threat in the sense that we're pro letting coal go away, but
that's
some
great.
other stuff.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay. One thing I'd like to mention that kind of came out in the chat is one of our species account authors is actually on the program tonight. Megan, could you say something so we can see you?
Sure. Hi, I'm Megan Massa, longtime Virginia birder, and now author for species accounts for a bunch of different species. As we've been on the call here, I've been working in the background on eastern meadowlark and bobolink. So excited to be able to share with everyone what I've been looking at on my day-to-day for the past couple months.
Great, thank you. We're looking really forward to seeing all those species accounts.
And I saw Steve Johnson asked a question about will the published atlas include graphics like we saw tonight? And Megan addressed it, but I'll just say broadly, yes, it definitely will. They're still working out how exactly the maps will be visualized but all of this stuff will be displayed. It's just a matter of exactly how it'll be formatted and whatnot.
Right. Paul mentioned that common mergansers now breed in DC, which is pretty cool. Obviously, the Potomac is a place where they're going to hang out. So, and I've seen them in the summer up at Great Falls and Riverbend. Guy had also a comment. We volunteers really saw this. You're talking about the changes in breeding timing. You saw this in the day-to-day atlasing where the breeding was earlier than the old phenology allowed. It was so cool to see that you're pulling the data out of that. Let me go on down to...
Like we had Megan actually asked a question about whether the public download of the Final Breeders database will have location information, and the answer is yes. I think that is probably the main thing that is slowing down it being published. Released is just still trying to figure out how best to handle things for sensitive species, Megan. So it's a very on-point question, and I think that's still being worked through a little bit. The folks who have lots of connections with eBird know that can be a challenging thing to sort of sort through. So I think once that gets worked out, then that will get published.
So I think we've hit most of the questions or all the questions that are in the chat. If anybody has any other questions, you can either turn on your mic and ask or hit the raise hand.
I'll chime in real quick.
Hey, Larry.
Hey, Ashley. I just wanted to echo your little tribute to Lewis. I did a blockbusting trip with you guys in Southern Virginia. I spent the day with him, and that was really something I always remember. So thanks for mentioning him. That's the only time I ever birded with him, but it was amazing.
Yeah, he was a good guy. I wish I could still have he and I shared a love of microbrewed beer and shared many a good beer talking
I'm on
birds.
board with
So.
you there.
Yeah.
It's exciting and intriguing to me that this, initially when we started with the Atlas, for me, it was a blast because we were focusing on learning things that we really weren't paying attention when we were just going out and observing birds and marking them off on our list. Now we had to learn a lot more details about the breeding behaviors, the breeding locations. It's really intriguing and exciting to me that this isn't just going to be a document that tells us, are the birds there, not there, and what's changed in terms of where they're planted for the breeding season, but it's almost raising more questions than I ever imagined it would, and leading us to direction for future research. So that's really exciting, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I wrote a
Go ahead,
column
Larry.
about that for our newsletter. Sorry, and I mentioned, yeah, it makes you bird in a different way. You have to slow down. You're not just checking them off your list. I mean, I try not to do that anyway, but there's always a temptation. Oh, check off, on to the next bird. You got to slow down. You gotta. What are they doing? What's in his mouth?
Yeah, I spent an hour in my backyard a couple of days ago watching a recently fledged northern mockingbird being fed.
Yeah.
You know, it was pretty cool.
Slow
Yeah.
birding.
Slow birding, baby. That's where it's at. And actually, you guys are raising a really good point. Thank you for bringing this up, both Diane and Larry. You know, there's sort of a narrative or a dialogue out there. If we have eBird, why would we still bother with doing BBAs? Why do we need to collect these types of data and whatnot? And I hope this talk today has illustrated the value of collecting this breeding evidence data and continuing to make this effort, because particularly none of the phenology work would be possible without it. And even, you know, with the detailed occupancy maps and the abundance maps, there's just important nuance in there that we would be missing if we didn't have the behavioral breeding evidence data collection as well. So I'm, you know, for my part, going to continue to remain an advocate for, you know, us continuing to do these projects in this way, and not least of all because it enriches our own experience of the birds and these habitats and the communities, bird communities. But yeah, thanks for bringing that up, guys. That's a good point.
Great. And I
You
guess good final comment here from Guy. Meeting all the people was such a wonderful part of this effort.
I agree. It was the funnest part about doing all of this, was getting to meet so many cool folks. And also, again, you know, meet so many folks in the context of, here, come work really hard for me for like 4 days, and have them show up and cheerfully do it. Yeah, it's pretty incredible to work with this community. And again, is the reason I've kind of continued along this career trajectory of staying in the citizen science arena, because I think you guys are not only a tremendous resource for generating data, but being advocates for birds and for habitat conservation. There's a lot of power in this community in that way as well. And don't forget that part. You guys have strong voices that you can lend, and I think in the coming years, you're going to be hearing more from me on that front, as well as on the citizen science opportunity front, particularly as it applies to Appalachian bird conservation. So,
Ashely, your work on the Atlas and your continuing work is a tremendous gift to birds and to Virginia, and we really appreciate that immensely, and appreciate you being here with us tonight. This was just really great. It was great to see you again, and then also to learn more about where we're heading with the Atlas and some of the things we've learned. But yeah, you've been a rock star, so thanks so much.
thank you. You're very kind. And any folks with follow-up questions, you know, they can publish my email address. I love hearing from you guys, and so feel free to reach out. Or, you know, if you just have questions about what's going on with birds and the apps, I love to hear from y'all. So thanks again for inviting me to speak tonight. It's really fun to kind of circle back after all these years.
Big round of applause for Ashely.
And congrats on the award winners. They're all highly deserved.
Yes, another round for Lee, Bill, and Jerry. You guys are marvelous, absolutely well deserved. It wasn't, you know, it was a long time coming, I would say, as well. And for the rest of you here, and I see most of our crew hung on through this, so this is really exciting. But I will look forward to seeing you in person one of these days, hopefully soon. We can get into some, maybe an in-person annual meeting. We do have an anniversary coming up, not too far away. 1929 was when the VSO was first founded. So we've got 100th anniversary to plan, and that'll be another something that we'll be looking for help. So if you're just keep that in mind as well. If somebody comes knocking on your door and says, "Come help us plan our anniversary celebration," be sure to say, "Sure." So thank you again. You guys are what makes our organization great. Really appreciate you. If you have any questions, we've got, many of you have our individual email addresses, but we regularly check the VSO email address. Reach out. Be great to hear from you. Does anybody have any questions before we sign off? Or on that note, have a lovely evening, get some great birds, and I hope to see you in the field. Take care, everybody.
Night.
Everybody. Thank you.